Angeles, January 15th, 1947. In a vacant lot, a woman's body is discovered half severed, drained of blood, and posed with deliberate precision. She has no identification, but soon the newspapers have given her a name, the Black Dahlia. Her murder will become one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. A story filled with obsession, corruption, and darkness, hiding behind Hollywood glamour. Today, I'm reopening the case, but this time, we're diving into the fictionalized investigation that explores not just the crime, but the psychological toll that it takes on everybody involved. This is the True Crime Fiction Files, and this is the Black Dahlia. Welcome. Today, I'm diving into the fictionalized investigation of this crime as told in James Ellroy's noir masterpiece, Elizabeth Short, The Black Dahlia. We've all heard the name. We have all been disgusted by the crime. Now, I was given a copy of a crime report that has never seen the light of day until now. Someone found the case file, and I was the lucky recipient. Now, it took a lot of time to verify the details in the file. It took me a little time to digest it. The savage details of what was done to her, the autopsy photos that painted a very horrific scene. Honestly, I was horrified. There is so much to unpack here. So let's dig in. It all started on one chilly morning on January 15th, 1947. The naked, mutilated body of Elizabeth Short was discovered on the 39th and Norton, just 22 years old. A whole life ahead of her, taken too soon. This case was horrific back when it happened. They used so many resources to find out what happened to Elizabeth Short that day, and they never had any idea who did it. Now, it was a bit of a media circus. They had a ton of false confessors. It made the whole case very messy and very public. The police were under massive scrutiny, and it was all mishandled. This case would have remained unsolved if it had not been for the brave person who thought to send me this case file. Police didn't fail. One cop did. He failed. The one cop who found the truth and buried it. We're going to find out why. So what do we know about Elizabeth Short? On July 29th, 1924, she was born in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. Now, her earlier part of her life, between 1943 and 1946, she makes frequent moves between Florida and California. Now, this period of time seems to be her drifting through Hollywood, fueled by a desire for stardom. So it's July 1946. She has returned to Southern California. She eventually starts living in a room behind the Florentine Gardens nightclub. January 9th, 1947. Are seen alive at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles between January 9th and 15th, 1947. This is her missing week. Now, in Ellroy's narrative, she is held captive and tortured for 2 whole days. 2 whole days. January 15th, 1947, her severed and mutilated body is finally discovered. And it's found in a vacant lot in Leimert Park. Tragic. But what do we really know about Elizabeth? Now, she was born in Medford, Massachusetts. She was one of 5 daughters. Her father basically abandoned the family when he lost all his money in the 1929 stock crash on Wall Street. Now, what ended up happening was he faked a suicide in order to start a new life. Now, her home life was anything but stable. She had severe health issues. We're talking bronchitis and severe asthma. Now, this is likely one of the reasons why she was moving to places like Florida during her very short life. She was essentially a 22-year-old drifter. Her life was marked by financial struggles and broken dreams. She was a Hollywood hopeful. She moved to LA from Boston in 1946. She fancied herself an aspiring actress. It's usually why people go to Hollywood, right? But she did not have one actor credit to her name. Curious. Very curious. Now, she was a waitress in a nightclub. Now, what did she look like? She had jet black hair, pale skin, and she had a petulance for wearing sheer black clothing. Now, she had poor dental hygiene. Making it into the business where people sell you on your looks was a hard sell when you have really bad teeth, and she used to fill her own cavities as she was low on money. She made up elaborate stories of having lost a child or a fiance in the war to gain sympathy. She was a master storyteller and was known to be impulsive and emotionally unstable. She was always asking people she did and didn't know for rides, money, small favors. These details are key components to understanding what happened and the why. Now, Los Angeles was a city where dreams were made and dreams were crushed, especially just after the war. Elizabeth Short was a sad little girl lost in the big city, full of men who were predatory. She was a pathological fabulist, and she used her stories to con men out of money. Now, that's a dangerous game to be playing, right? She was obsessed with her appearance, obsessed. She wore the black clothing, and she had white powder that she used to use on her face to hide her bad teeth. It was basically a costume. It was a way of fighting back against the world who saw her as disposable. Some of the things going forward, things you will hear, will paint an even starker view of who she really was. Things that never made it into the media. Things that you may not wish to know. It was all documented in this file that she was involved in some rather seedy things to stay afloat. Now, she did an illicit movie, something called a stag film, where she had sex with another woman. Now, there is no doubt that she was a bit of a siren, and men became obsessed with her. But to go the route of creating such a movie, the only thing that she ever acted in is rather telling of her financial situation at the time. What was she doing in the weeks leading up to her murder? As we already know, she was financially unstable. At this point, she was unemployed, moving between hotels and borrowed rooms. She was severely depressed. She was also known to date men for meals. She would go out for dinner with them. She would eat because there was no other way that she could afford to. She would have them get her into a nightclub by paying for it, and then she'd ghost them. Crazy, right? I don't know about you, but I'm seeing a very dangerous game being played by a very vulnerable woman. And at some point, one of these days, a man was going to be upset enough that she would have been in real danger. Now, there is also a note on the file that she had turned to prostitution. It was noted in the file that she was hired by Johnny Vogel. Yes, that Johnny Vogel, the son of a very powerful businessman back in the time. And this was one of the avenues of police inquiry that came up a lot. Now, where was she last sighted? She went on a trip with a man called Robert Red Manley. They went to San Diego. She was dropped off at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9th, 1947 to meet her sister. There were handfuls of days between her last sighting and when her body turned up dead. Now, let's take a quick look at the investigation. Now, what I can tell you is police corruption was rampant. Evidence went missing, especially during this time. You also have to understand the underground crime in LA especially was rampant. Okay, let's start with where the body was found. Now, as I've said before, it was a cold morning, and local resident Betty Bersinger was out walking with her daughter in Limerick Park. She spotted what she thought at the time was one of those mannequins that you see in shop windows for clothing. Now, it was on a vacant lot on the south end of Norton Avenue. The body was in a terrible, terrible state. Body was completely severed in half at the waist. It was completely drained of blood. It gave her skin a more eerie porcelain color. And strangely, the body had been meticulously washed and the blood drained somewhere else before being dumped there. Now, the worst part is still to come. The smile. She had been slashed from the corners of her mouth up to her ears, creating this horrible smile. It was dubbed the Glasgow smile. Now, both halves were positioned about a foot apart with her arms over her head, elbows bent at 90-degree angles. And the whole thing looked ritualistic. The only thing found at the crime scene were tire tracks and a cement sack with a small amount of watery blood. The whole scene brought a media circus and a half, and the police were under pressure, intense pressure, to get this solved quickly. All the police had to go on at this point was the body, the lack of blood, one heel print, and the tire tracks, the cement sack with the blood. Now, that's really not much to go on at all. How can you solve a crime this way? But one other thing that happened during this time was an envelope was sent to the Los Angeles Examiner. It literally had Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, business cards, and photographs. Her address book that included the names of several men who would all later become suspects. Everything had been gasoline cleaned, meaning there were no fingerprints to be found at all. We do discover later that a detective found the shack where she was murdered. But again, it's not in the official records. Something else to note. There was a clown painting with the very same smile that had been cut into Elizabeth's face. We'll get to that. And another thing to have noted, that the bisection on her body had to have been done by a surgeon, somebody with knowledge of anatomy. Again, that's going to be important later. And we learn another detective had already figured out who had done it and was extorting the murderer. Yes, like I said, police corruption was big back then. Big. It's getting very intriguing though, isn't it? Did you know that James Ellroy wrote this work of fiction because of what happened to his mother? It's something that I didn't know before starting, and actually was quite heartbreaking to read. You can have a look at that online, just type in the author's name. Now let's take a quick look at the detectives that were in charge of this case. Dwight Bucky Bleichert. Now, Bucky begins this story as something rare in noir fiction. He's a man that believes in order. He's disciplined. He has control and is deeply invested in the idea of justice. A former boxer turned cop, Bucky lived by structure, rules, routine, and a rigid sense of morality. At the start of this investigation, he sees the world in much simpler terms. Good versus evil. Law versus crime. Truth versus lies. But there was something about this Black Dahlia case that shattered that certainty for him. One of Bucky's defining traits is restraint. He is literally a man who suppresses emotion, his anger. He also suppresses his desires. He learned how to suppress his fear. Paints a picture, doesn't it? He believes control equates to strength. But underneath that calm exterior lies insecurity, jealousy, and a deep need for approval. Now, this case forces him into the moral gray areas he has never had to face before. And as he digs deeper into the Black Dahlia murder, he begins to lose the clarity that once defined him. From what I could read here, this wasn't so much about solving the crime. He lost his innocence. He went from being an idealistic investigator into a man haunted by obsession. He became less interested in the justice and more consumed by the need to understand the darkness behind the crime. By the end of the investigation, Bucky is no longer chasing the truth. He is chasing closure. And in this case, closure comes at an devastating psychological cost. Let's take a look at his partner next. Lee Blanchard. He represented order. Lee represents the chaos. He was charismatic, impulsive, emotionally volatile. Lee is the type of detective who doesn't just investigate the cases, he becomes them. He loves intensely, loves obsessively, and carries a darkness that feels constantly on the verge of exploding. From the moment the Black Dahlia case begins, Lee forms an immediate and disturbing fixation on the victim. Lee Blanchard is driven by obsession. And it wasn't just this case, but with the idea of saving someone he could not save before. He has past trauma, particularly involving his missing sister. This has shaped his psychological connection to the Black Dahlia. Now, for Lee, this investigation is not about justice. It's about redemption. That emotional investment makes him increasingly unstable. As the case intensifies, Lee's obsession begins to spiral into self-destruction, reckless in a way that no detective should ever become. He becomes secretive. He becomes emotionally consumed by it. His focus, it shifts. It shifts from solving the crime to personal vengeance and emotional closure. And in classic noir fashion, this obsession leads him towards tragedy. Lee doesn't just investigate the Black Dahlia case. He literally disappears right into it. And in doing so, he becomes another casualty of this barbaric crime. We've looked at the detectives. Now let's look at the main suspects at the time. First of all, the police looked at Mark Hansen. Now, he was the owner of the restaurant where she had worked, the Florentine Gardens. Now, he was also the one who sent in the package, the envelope, to the press. He had ties to the crime world, which made him a very likely suspect. But after a very careful investigation into him, he was ultimately eliminated. Robert Red Manley. He was literally the last person to see her alive. He was most likely to have done it based on the timeline. They had gone away together, and no one remembers seeing her after he dropped her off. But now he actually did have an alibi, and he was also eliminated. Joseph Dulange. He was a very minor blip on the radar. He had a solid alibi. Bobby DeWitt, a pimp, a criminal. He was a person of interest for a very, very long time, but nothing ever came of it. So this is where we get into the crux of the crime. Let's talk about the Sprague family. Wealthy, distinctive group of people, a true criminal family. Now, the first thread that we're going to pull at is about the movie that she starred in, that stag movie we talked about. This family was involved in the production. The investigation leads to the discovery of the video. They discover that the family had ties to a pornographic ring, and that Emmett, the patriarch of the family, was using his business to facilitate these illegal activities. Plot really is thickening, isn't it? Let's take a quick look at his daughter, Madeline. She was dressing, acting, emulating the Black Dahlia. The dossier I have on her isn't flattering. Now, she even used one of the detectives on the case and manipulated him. Now, you're probably going, it was her. It was her. And she does sound really likely. But no, close, but no cigar. Now, let's take a look at Ramona, the matriarch. She is well known for being a real control freak and living life with a man like her husband, a sexual deviant. It must have been a hard thing to live through, even with all that money. Her family money too. And then we're just going to touch real briefly on a man called Georgie Tilden. Georgie and Ramona had previously had an affair. So this family is incestuous because he was their groundskeeper. And also a weird coincidence that the family with ties to the movie also had ties to the employee who had invited her out to go on a date. Weird, right? Now, this for me is where it gets really, really bonkers. With Georgie and Ramona, obviously Georgie is the groundskeeper, they were having an affair for a very long time. But Georgie was interested in Elizabeth, and this really filled Ramona with rage. Nothing had happened between them, between Georgie and Elizabeth, but Georgie had a deep obsession with Elizabeth. And it's a really weird obsession because Elizabeth looked just like his daughter. And he had seen the movie that she had made. I know, I'm shuddering inside too. Now, he lured Elizabeth to the shack where she was murdered under false pretenses, telling her it was a date. But in reality, he was actually part of a group of men that were exploiting young women. Now, sexual exploitations back in the 40s was basically like currency. And Elizabeth, she fell into the web and she paid with her life. Now, you're probably wondering, how did Georgie manage to convince such a young girl to go with him? Now, he used his charm and his flattery to lower her defenses. Bringing her to the shack meant isolation and control, and making sure that she did not feel safe in her environment. The shack created psychological pressure and the subtlety of showing Elizabeth that she was at his mercy. Now, Ramona, being the mentally unstable wife of Emmett, knowing that he married her for her money and that their daughter was not actually his, but Georgie's. This family was a complete and utter mess. So her anger and jealousy stemmed from a deep-seated need to keep Georgie from dating a girl that looked just like their daughter. And she was absolutely seething in jealousy. So what happened on that fateful night? Now, Ramona, who was getting suspicious, followed Georgie to the shack where he was meeting Elizabeth for their supposed date. She was suspicious, obviously, hence why she followed him, because she knew what his world looked like. Now, this is a very important distinction that I need you to understand. She was not there to rescue Elizabeth. That's not why she followed him. But in a fit of madness, she beat Elizabeth to death right in front of Georgie, making him complicit in her murder. She snapped. Her mental health was literally the driving force here. It was never premeditated, but it was a sudden, impulsive act of sheer violence. One has to wonder if her snap happened because she was looking at Elizabeth and seeing her daughter, and maybe she was killing her daughter. I can't answer that. That's not in my notes anywhere, but it was a thought that I had had. Now, that smile that was cut into her face was actually from a painting Ramona had owned of a clown. It was a creepy clown featuring that smile. Now, was Ramona mocking the innocence of Elizabeth? A symbolic degradation of Elizabeth's identity? They literally spent days mutilating her body. Ramona was fueled by rage, and Georgie, it was all about the ritual of control. They dismembered her, cutting her body into sections. They tortured her, prolonging their gratification. They slashed and cut at her body. Now, to keep Georgie's silence, Ramona offered to give him Elizabeth's organs to keep, because he liked to touch dead things, and he was the one with the skills needed to cut Elizabeth with such precision. Now, after they are done, they move the body and stage it, dismembered and mutilated. Now, one question that I did have, and it kept popping up in my mind, was that if you commit a murder and it wasn't premeditated, why would you stage the body rather than just burying it? She would have just been another missing woman. Seriously, many women disappear without a trace. But they wanted dominance even in death, and it was so sadistic. Now ask yourself why this information was buried, because this is on my mind too. Now, the detective on the case, Bucky, knew that Ramona and Georgie committed the crime. He figured it out. Now, it's one thing to murder somebody, but what they did was above and beyond the realm of accidental death. They didn't leave it at just murder. They made it gruesome. Bucky was morally compromised. He knew that they were dangerous and very unstable, and yet he chose to leave them free. Something that I did note in the file is I think he was trying to cover up his own parts because it would have looked like he was implicated in the crime as well. Something else to note, Ramona was known to have lupus, and one has to wonder if she was gravely ill, and that was another reason that Bucky buried evidence. It's no excuse, but these are all things that I'm factoring in. Honestly, I'm quite flummoxed. It shows just how corrupt the police were, especially a detective who was so on the straight and narrow, and how big a presence the seedy underbelly of Hollywood did with the corrupting sexual exploitation of women. And the police basically ignore it. They left Georgie's group going too. Bucky also had feelings for Ramona's daughter, Madeline. She also looked like the Black Dahlia. So that's another reason I think that the detective buried this case. There was no justice for Elizabeth. The detective put his own needs and wants ahead of bringing these perpetrators to justice. Now, I couldn't save her life, but I can make sure that her murderers are finally named. This whole case shaped the detective, his morality, and his own obsessions. Now, it saddens me that one person felt the need to protect criminals over justice. Elizabeth's death was much more than just a horrific murder. It shows the corrosive power of obsession, the fractured souls of humanity. In the hands of Ramona and Georgie, their violence became both personal and symbolic. It was a grotesque performance of envy and control and the frailty of the human body. He went against his promise to serve and protect. It was a very sad day. Rest in peace, Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia of our hearts. This isn't just a crime story. This was a stark view of the dark underbelly of ambition, innocence, and corruption. I wonder what else we will see when the lights of Hollywood finally fade. That was a wild ride, hey? Now, I hope you enjoyed my true crime fiction episode of The Black Dahlia by James Elroy. Now, his book was written with a mix of true crime and fictionalized elements that he couldn't possibly have known, but he created quite the story. It was a very, very dark book. Now, unfortunately, in real life, the case of the Black Dahlia has never actually been solved. But maybe one day it will be. Guys, I hope you have the reading week you deserve, and I will catch you on the next one. Take care, readers.